Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Sebastian Bae, whose work principally focuses on wargaming, emerging technologies, the future of warfare, and strategy and doctrine for the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps. Sebastian Bae, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Hey, thank you. I'm really excited to talk about gaming with you all on this podcast.
The conversation I'd like to have with you today, Sebastian, will cover, unsurprisingly, gaming in a national security context. But before we get into this topic, could we please start by getting your assessment of our strategic landscape?
So I'll take that question in terms of what is the strategic landscape for gaming in national security and defense. In terms of that perspective where I sit, it is both an exciting time and sort of concerning time. In terms of analytical gaming, games designed to produce some form of analysis or insight or knowledge generation, it is, has been good for a little bit, right? Where there has been lots of focus and money as the services are trying to transform themselves into that form of analysis, right? What can games tell us about the future of warfare, about future budget decisions, about how the services should look and buy and so forth? On the educational side, it is also a bit more exciting, personally, where we are focusing on how can we fit educational gaming to shape the force of leaders that will one day lead our services, right? From the Marine Corps, Air Force, Navy, and the Army, right? And this is down to the most tactical NCO, right, the non-commissioned officer, to the most senior officer. We are thinking about how do educational games fit into their educational and training pipeline in a career, right? How can we have games be part of that experiential, synthetic learning that we can make them better leaders and better decision makers? This is a field that is, has been consistent since the beginning of wargaming history, but has gone up and down. And we're really excited that there's a growing movement in various services and their schoolhouses to do more educational gaming.
There are some in our audience, I would imagine, who are somewhat unfamiliar with gaming in a national security context. Do you think you could just shed a light on what are the variety of games that people are employing these days?
So there are two principal ways to really think about games, either commercially or hobby industry, and professionally, what we do here at like CNA and Georgetown. We'll talk about mostly form because that's the thing that most people understand, which is there are a couple different forms. The way we think about games professionally in terms of form is how we think about how actions are judged, either rigid or open and sort of close and open, right? Rigid means that it is some form of rule set that defines all the rules, right? Does that make sense? Like a commercial game will often have rigid rules that only define what it says, right? You can do, right? Players cannot do anything else that are not rigid rules, right? Or defined in the rules, right? On the opposite end of that spectrum is that like matrix games, right? They're not rigid. They allow rules or actions to happen beyond the rule set, and really just tells you how essentially they collectively make the rules, right? And a lot of these are oral argument based, right? So they tend to have all those sort of elements that allow them to have a wider range of actions. For instance, a matrix game can say, hey, this is what I want to do with this counterinsurgency, and this is how I will do it. And the game will allow them to do something like that, right? And you can collectively, right, decide of what that your probability of success can be, right? And then there's open and close. Open essentially says, hey, all the adjudication and is done in front of all the players. Either they're aware of how that has happened, right? Or they understand the logic behind it, right? Most commercial games are open and rigid, which means that everyone can read the rule book, everyone understands how it happens, and everyone understands why a result has happened the way it did. A closed one often means that there's some kind of facilitation involved, that there is a person or group of people that are doing the answers for, or are determining the outcomes of their decisions for them according to a rule book or some collective, adjudication style, right? So usually they're sit on that pole, right? And then in terms of form, we also think about, is it manual or like physical tabletop, right? Like a map or pieces on a board and so forth. And then we also think about it in the dimension of, is it digitalization, right? Does it use some kind of app? Is it a software and so forth? And we also think about the type of core action games are asking you to do. For example, if you talk to a hobby gamer, they'll say, "Oh, this is a resource management game," right? And you're like, "Oh, what does that mean?" It means that the game's fundamental action, its core engine, is asking you to like manage resources like up or down, make more of something, trade something for something else, like Catan, right? The very popular game about building cities in this sort of fantasy island, right? That is a resource management game. I must trade sheep for wood and wood for building cities and so forth. You're trying to balance all these different things.
So there's a lot of flexibility and creativity that goes into developing these and playing the games. And I suppose one of the major features includes being able to provide a educational and training environment that is considerably less expensive than like live training exercises with troop like small deployments to say like 29 Palms or other exercise locations where the experience is more realistic, I suppose, but it's also a lot more expensive. So there's a cost trade-off here.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And the real question is, does it address decision making, right? And games are fundamentally about decisions and consequences and that interaction in some kind of synthetic environment, right? The game is the place, the arena of your decisions, and the consequences are what make it contextual and important and have intensity of any kind, right? Peter Perlo, who wrote The Art of Wargaming, always used to say, like, the game happens in the mind of our players, and everything else, the map, the pieces, they're just really ways for the game to be structured collectively as a group around the players for that mind exercise.
Yeah, cool stuff. So what is your personal story relative to gaming? How did you get into this?
I'll keep this one short. So I came to Georgetown University for my grad master's program. And then I got a job offer to be a foreign affairs officer for the State Department. And I was waiting for that. I was doing some freelance work for Foreign Policy magazine for Thomas Ricks, who was a great mentor of mine. And I was in Iraq at the time, covering some stories about ISIS and so forth, and the refugees and IDPs in northern Iraq. During that time, I got incredibly ill, and I was like hugging the toilet, and I was like, strung out on on the hotel bathroom, just so sick, right? And then I was like, oh, there must be an easier way to do this. Get a job, right? Like a normal job. So I ended up applying for many jobs, including the one down at the Marine Corps' warfighting lab in their wargaming division. And it asked for someone who knew the Marine Corps, who knew how to do analysis and knew about games. I was like, I'm a hobby gamer. I know how to do analysis, and I was a Marine. So I hit all three of those boxes, right? I have never done professional gaming before then, but I was like, I have all the ingredients you're asking for.
Nailed it. Nailed it.
Yeah, nailed it.
What time period was this again?
This was 2015.
Okay, got it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So You know what I mean? I got the job, eventually switched over careers essentially, and then I was really excited to learn how to do games, and I found myself doing quite well at it. And then eventually I moved over to RAND, where I ended up doing it more, and then now I'm at the Center for Naval Analysis, also known as CNA, where I do it pretty much full time.
Right. Oh, and you also have a position at Georgetown, don't you?
Yes, absolutely. So I teach a design course in the graduate program in the security studies program, where my students will research, design, develop, play test, and execute a original educational game that is manual, which is like tabletop and physical components for a group of DoD sponsors. And they will be playtesting their game actually in a few weeks for their final, which they're all very nervous about.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure. Uh, the word design comes up frequently for me, and I'm curious, what do you mean by design in a gaming context, or maybe even in a broader context? But could you just give a quick 101 on what design means and why it's important?
Oh, wow. Asking the heavy questions. So design, when we talk about game design, is really thinking about what we call the game system, right? What are the bounds that define the player decision space, right? So, you know what I mean? John, what's the last game you played? Or that last game you know how to like remember playing? It could be anything.
Uh, Last night, my wife and daughter and I played Roomy Cube.
Okay. All right. So I don't know Rumi Cube, so you have to walk me through it a little bit. But
It's
in terms,
it's like Rummy, the card game
oh,
Rummy,
okay.
with like flushes and straights, except you're playing with tiles instead of cards.
Oh, perfect, right? So in Rooming Cube or Rummy or any game, whether that's Monopoly or Risk, right? All games define a decision space. What
Mhm.
can and can you not do, right? Or what person are you representing, right? So in Monopoly, that's decision space is defined by the notion like you're a real estate mogul, right? And you're buying and selling property, right? And goods, and you're flipping mortgages and so forth, right? And Rumi Cube, right? Your hand, right? If I'm trying to remember how to play Rummy, right?
Yeah,
Is
right.
your
Yeah.
hand defines your decision space, right? There's only a couple of actions you can do when it is your turn, right? Whether that's taking a card, laying a card, and so forth, and trying to produce that outcome that you want, right? Same thing for poker or blackjack, right? And game systems are literally just define how those interactions happen and what those bounds are, right? If you do A, you cannot do B, or you can do A, if then, or statements like that, right? So if you do A, then you can do B, right? So for example, a perfect example would be if I lay a card down, I may draw a card after, right? That's you know what I mean, a simple context of a rule. But fundamentally, when we think about design, we not only think about the mechanical interactions of the game system, right? The things of can I draw these many cards? How many do I start with? How do these pieces move, right? What do these cards do, right? We also think about what we call the narrative space, right? About what is the story that the game is inhabiting? What is the role of the players, and what do I want them to feel emotionally when they play these games, right? A lot of game designers will call those storyboarding, right? It's like, what is the experience of the players that I want them to experience while they play my game, right? Whether that is the surge of buying property in Monopoly, or the sort of understanding of how colonialism works in John Company, right? Which is about the British East Indian Company, right? And the wealth generation aspect of that, right? So there's a bunch of different ways to do it.
I understand that you are coming out with a new game here before too long called Malign, and it uh, is, I think, designed to go into helping information operations practitioners get involved more in the gaming world. Can you talk about this game and how you are envisioning information operations practitioners using it?
Yeah, Malign is a tabletop game designed by my co-designer and I, Emily Yoler, who works at Rand, and myself. Malign is a card-driven educational game with rigid rules where players must grapple with like the pernicious effects of malign influence while attempting to foster social resilience in their own countries. The game takes place in a fictional geography with fictional countries, but they essentially have to play cards to produce a campaign or influence campaign. And these cards are broken into three major categories, right? Intent, method, and amplifier, right? When we were doing the research for influence operations, both for malign or social resiliency, all have these three major components: some kind of intent or purpose to them, some kind of major method, and some kind of often amplifying method that will support the main effort, right? Put it very simplistically, right? So a good example of this, right, in our game would be, for example, the intent could be social divisions. The major method could be online radicalization, and then the amplifying method could be conspiracy theories, right? The game only thinks about it in terms of hardware, right? In terms of capability, right? What is the thing you're trying to do, right? But as you probably know, right, and your audience knows, these capabilities must be strung together by some kind of story or narrative that makes them cohesive and compelling for people, right? So the game asks them to say, hey, when you play these cards, you will have to weave a story, right? So of those story I just gave of social divisions, online radicalization, and conspiracy theories, I may tell my players to be like, hey, what I'm trying to do is that in your country of Dionysia, right, I'm gonna tell this you're a minority population that the government is coming out for them and they don't care about them, and I'm trying to radicalize your youth through these forums on Discord and so forth, right? I'm going to use this conspiracy theory that this fictional person was killed and taken away and kidnapped, right, by the government, right? And that's the story I'm going to tell, right? And the whole idea is to have players understand the two major components, which is the taxonomy of influence campaigns in general, whether they be malign or for social resiliency, which is sort of like what are the different types of methods, right? Whether that's bot armies or influencers or anything else, right? Because often the capabilities can go either way. They can be used both for good things and for bad things, but I also want them to understand that it is part of a narrative, like a story, that it is often the compelling portion of that capability campaign.
Yeah, cool stuff. And I'm sure that there are people in our audience that are going to want to get their hands on this and experiment with it. So, to our audience, there are links in the show notes to Sebastian's web pages at both Georgetown and CNA, and you can connect with Sebastian via those websites. Um, do you think that influence war games can be used to help the public understand what IO looks like and how it works? Beyond just a national security user base.
Yeah, absolutely. So that was sort of the main purpose behind Malign, the Hybrid Center of Excellence for the Hybrid Threats Center of Excellence in Helsinki, Sweden. They were our partner in creating Malign in the sense that they sponsored the major topic and they helped us with the research, right? And they have partners with us in the running many different iterations of the game overseas with our allies and partners in Europe. And the main purpose of the game for Malign was to have some way to educate and also spur discussion about influence campaigns in around the world, right? And it had to be for a multilingual environment. So the game has tried to have a like an easy conversational component of it, right? That's what the narrative portion of the game is. And the card-based game is pretty simple. It's adding up numbers of cards, and they have symbols to help to understand which one is in what category. But the point was to help them have that conversation of like, this is what we're talking about when we talk about influence campaigns. These are the capabilities you must be concerned about. And it was to have that component of learning, like very similar to like flashcards, right? Flashcard learning. And that was the hope. And there are many ways to learn through games, and I'm hoping that we do more and more with it in the IO space.
Back to the Malign game, Sebastian. Who is the intended audience or the intended player base for this game?
So when we started designing this game, our original core audience that we wanted to design this game for was college students, like graduate, undergraduate students, but also all the way up to like, foreign service officers and policymakers in various countries, because we wanted it to be both educational in the sense that, we can go to campuses and run into this for class, and students would be like, aha, I understand what you mean, or I understand how the media literacy happens, or I understand how disinformation and malign influence and the power of these tools can do, right? Um, and then we also wanted to do this very similar thing of education and collaborative like discussion with policymakers and foreign service officers from different countries, because this was done in collaboration with like Hybrid Threat Center of Excellence, right, which looks at the space for NATO, right, and they are multinational. They have officers from all around the alliance, and they really look at the space of disinformation, misinformation, and so forth.
Are human computer interaction teams being employed to develop influence war games?
So not yet. So, human machine teaming has not come to the point in the design cycle yet where we embrace it fully. Chat GPT, has really sort of open the door wide open of how AI and other tools can help us design, right? But right now, for all of the designers I know, even the leading ones, they have not designed a full game using like some kind of AI component that is your code designer, right? But we all are experimenting with it, like and we're trying to figure out what is in the bounds of what is good, what is ethical to do. Like, for example, there's an interesting discussion in our field, right? Both commercially and professionally in the national security realm of asking, should we use generative image AIs, right? Like Dolly or was it Wooba or whatever? There are a bunch of AIs that will create images for you. We see them all on Twitter and Facebook and so forth, right? Um, but the idea for us as game designers, like, should we use these, right? Often we use illustrators that are human and graphic artists that employ our vision, right? But is it ethically okay to use these generative AIs, right? Especially
Mm.
since they use copyright images of others, often of our peers who are graphic artists, right? But it also costs money, right, to use their services because they get wages, right? And there's this huge debate about it in our field. For me, I'm like, you should use generative AI for prototyping and things that are quick and dirty. And but for commercialization, right, you should definitely never use it, in my opinion, right? Because you should use copyright work of original artists that is designed for your game, and use that generative AI as just a way for you to be able to explain your vision better to your illustrator. That's how I see it, but other people disagree, right? And it is causing some strife in our field.
It always blows me away as to how interdisciplinary these fields can get. So we just had a interesting discussion, and there'll be a link in the show notes to a researcher from Texas A&M. His name is Tom Ferris, and his research emphasis is on cognitive ergonomics. And one of the things that he brought up that is a challenge for researchers in his field is to create um, research environments which put people into a simulated stressful situation, but there's ethics involved, right? I mean, you can't literally put somebody into, or I mean, you can, but ethically, most researchers choose not to put people into a dangerous environment, right, where they can literally get harmed, right? So the goal is to try to create a synthetic environment which simulates that danger, but the researcher and the participant are actually not in danger. Anyway, I got some hints of that kind of ethical dilemma from you as well when you were talking about how to continue advancing the gaming industry in a way that's ethical. Would you say that that's fair?
Yeah, absolutely, right? So how can we ethically stay within the bounds of each other's works, right? As much as the creative process is an open process, but at the same time, I mean, people rely on their creativity and their work and often require for it to be shared, right? And you don't want to undermine people's work by stealing it, right? Which AI, so accusations of stealing people's work is what generative AI in terms of images has been accused of, right? You'll see images with people's copyright or their like logo in it because it has scraped their images, right? And so forth. So it's a big struggle still. Yeah.
Mm, right. Well, fascinating field that you're in, Sebastian. Really, really relevant as well to information operations and how we collectively engage with the problem and iterate on solutions as well. I'd like to maybe go into a lightning round and then close out. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Live action role playing or LARPing.
So one of my colleagues, SNA, used to do LARPing when he was in, I think he was doing his PhD course, and he tells me that it is the part that helped him learn to be a good game designer and good facilitator, where you essentially are LARPing or live action role playing different roles, right? Whether that be historical, fantasy, movie based, whatever that may be, and you are trying to make this collective story part work. And as you know, I mean, he always says like, hey, there's always problems that arise when you're LARPing. Someone breaks character, or someone does something weird, or someone suggests something off script, and you have to adapt to it. And he's like, that's what made him a good facilitator. I don't do a lot of LARPing myself, right? But I mean, I would love it, you know what I mean, to try because I think it's so interesting. Like for example, Civil War reenactment can be considered LARPing, right? And
Mhm,
all that
mhm.
sort of things.
Yeah. Um, the metaverse or virtual reality.
Oh, there's so much hype around this, and literally, I have a not virtual reality, but AR, augmented reality tool sitting on my desk at work right now because we as a team are trying to explore what these tools have in terms of value to us as professional game designers for the Department of Defense. So we're thinking about how can we use this to incorporate some of our games, what features or advantages do these systems offer? Are they worth the payout in terms of cost and of infrastructure and effort, right? And we're still experimenting with it, right? And a lot of challenges still exist because of the rules around new technologies in the government. But we are actively pushing the envelope with some of these technologies. I'm really excited for it. I'm gonna spend about 2 hours this afternoon playing with AR and see how they can be used in our games.
All right. And the last lightning round, and I'm not going to do this justice, but I'm going to give it a shot here. Okay. Leroy Jenkins.
One, I love how this joke from the internet, from the early days of the internet, are still roaming around because I love it. So for me, it reminds me of people that I game with, right? When there's always that one person of like they just go off and do their own thing, which Leroy Jenkins has become. But as a game designer, I also think about it in the sense is that is your game resilient, right? Can your game withstand people who do not act like your game is I wants them to do, right? And can it still bounce back and put them back on course, right? Because if your game is not resilient and it only works for certain types of players who know what your game is trying to have them do, then your game is not very good. It should be able to adapt to shocks to the system when someone is like goes off track, does their own thing, goes Leroy Jenkins on your game, and your game should be able to put them back on track.
Okay, very good. And I will put a link to a YouTube video that for those in our audience who are unfamiliar with the Leroy Jenkins phenomenon, check out the YouTube. All right, closing out, Sebastian. So we have a lot of students and researchers who listen to this podcast. Could you offer a research question that a student might take a crack at relative to gaming?
Oh man, there's so many. One of the big things I was discussing this past week at the Naval War College with my colleagues up there is how do we measure or at least assess education progress or you know what I mean of experiential methods like gaming, right? There's a growing literature about it. in other fields from medicine to our own field of national security and social science that games do teach. And Amanda Rosen, or Dr. Amanda Rosen up at the Naval War College, just did an article about that, looking at their students up there, about how they have used games and how they are looking at improving, how they see improvements using methods of game-based learning. But that's still a very fruitful area for exploration. Also, I think the good question is like, how do games change, right? How do the synthetic experience of games change depending on the medium you're using versus tabletop versus digital versus AR, VR, and so forth, right? I'm really curious of where that goes.
Great questions. And last, could you offer a good book or other online resource that an interested audience member might check out if they want a deeper dive into some of these areas?
Yeah, so if you're interested in wargaming, go to the YouTube channel for the Georgetown University Wargaming Society. I help run it as the faculty advisor. We have over 200 video lectures that we do every other Tuesday now, and it features everything from commercial designers to professional DoD designers from the Air Force, Navy, and so forth. And it's a great resource for you to put on in the background and listen to about how gaming affects policy, education, to the games on the table, right? If you're interested on that one. So that's one great way. I'm reading a book called You Said It Will Be Fun, looking at what makes games good, right? What characteristics and elements of games are good, makes them powerful and compelling. And then on a more broader sort of field, I'm reading right now um, um, on operations by Brett Freeman, right? B.A. Freeman, looking at it about operational art and if there is an operational level of war, which is a fascinating book right now.
All right. Sebastian Bae, thank you so much for being a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
Hey, thank you for having me. I look forward to coming back.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.